Right now, somewhere in America, there is a person making the exact same paycheck as you, living in a house about the same size as yours, driving a car worth about the same amount, and in 20 years, that person will retire with hundreds of thousands of dollars more than you, while you are still refreshing your bank app before payday, hoping the number is bigger than you remember. Same income, same effort, same hours worked, completely different ending. And the terrifying part is that the gap between you and that other version of your life has nothing to do with luck, nothing to do with some secret stock tip, and nothing to do with being born into money. It comes down to a handful of quiet, everyday habits, so small, so socially accepted, so completely normal, that almost nobody ever notices they're doing them, until one day they wake up in their 50s and realize the distance between them and real financial freedom has become a canyon they can no longer cross. This is not a story about bad luck. This is a story about the habits that keep smart, hardworking, well-meaning people permanently stuck in the middle, no matter how much money passes through their hands. And by the time this is over, you may recognize yourself in more of these than you'd like to admit. Let's start with the one nobody wants to talk about, because it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like a reward. Every time your income goes up, your lifestyle quietly goes up right alongside it. A raise lands, and within a few weeks, a nicer car shows up in the driveway, or the apartment gets traded for something bigger, or the vacations get a little more expensive, a little more frequent. It never feels like overspending in the moment. It feels like finally getting to enjoy what you've worked so hard for. Economists have a name for this pattern. They call it lifestyle inflation, and it might be one of the most effective wealth traps ever created, precisely because it disguises itself as success. Nobody consciously sits down and decides to stay broke forever. They simply upgrade one thing at a time, and each individual upgrade feels completely justified, even responsible. But underneath that reasonable-sounding story, the math tells a very different one. If your expenses climb at the same rate as your income, the gap between what you earn and what you spend never actually widens, no matter how many promotions you collect along the way. And that gap, that space sitting quietly between income and expenses, is the only place real wealth is ever allowed to grow. Without it, you could double your salary twice over and still be living paycheck to paycheck 20 years from now, just with a much nicer paycheck to be broke on. So why does this keep happening to intelligent, capable people generation after generation? Because human beings almost never compare their income to their own past. They compare it to the people standing next to them. Behavioral economists call this the reference point problem. You don't feel wealthy or poor based on a raw number sitting in your account. You feel wealthy or poor based on what your neighbor appears to have, what your coworker just posted online, what your old college roommate seems to be driving now. The second a friend buys a new car, your own car suddenly feels older than it did yesterday, even though absolutely nothing about it has physically changed. This comparison engine runs quietly in the background of nearly every financial decision people make, and it is exhausting because it never, ever ends. There is always someone with a bigger house, a nicer vacation, a newer phone. Chasing that constantly moving target isn't a financial plan, it's a treadmill. And the American middle class has been sprinting on that treadmill for decades, convinced the finish line is just a little further ahead, never realizing the treadmill was never designed to take them anywhere at all. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the second habit almost looks like the exact opposite problem, and yet somehow it produces the identical outcome. While one group of people spends every extra dollar the moment it lands in their account, another group does everything that sounds responsible. They save diligently. They avoid flashy purchases. They keep a healthy cushion sitting in the bank, and they still end up poorer relative to where they could have been than they ever imagined possible. Why does this happen to the cautious, careful people too? Because they never actually put that money to work. It sat in a low-interest savings account, growing by a few dollars a month, feeling safe, feeling responsible, feeling like the smart adult thing to do. But money sitting still in a savings account isn't actually standing still at all. It's quietly losing value every single year because of something most people learned about once in school and then completely forgot to apply to their own lives: inflation. Prices for everything from groceries to rent tend to climb steadily over time, and if your savings aren't growing faster than that climb, you are watching your purchasing power shrink in real terms, even while the number on the screen keeps ticking upward. This might be one of the cruelest illusions in all of personal finance, because it feels like the opposite of risk. But refusing to invest isn't the absence of risk. It's simply trading one risk, the ups and downs of the market, for a quieter, slower, far more guaranteed risk, the steady erosion of everything you've worked to save. This fear of investing rarely comes from a lack of intelligence. It usually comes from a story someone was told, sometimes by parents who lived through a painful recession, sometimes from their own timing, putting money in right before a downturn, and swearing off the whole idea forever after. That one bad experience calcifies into a permanent belief. The market is basically a casino. Only the wealthy can afford to gamble in it, and the smartest, safest move is to stay completely out. But here's the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath that belief. Historically, broad, long-term stock market investing has been one of the most reliable paths ordinary Americans have used to build real wealth. Not because anyone timed it perfectly, but because they stayed invested consistently for years, sometimes decades, and let something unglamorous and slow do the heavy lifting for them, compounding. Nobody makes a thrilling YouTube video about compounding. It doesn't trend. There's no dramatic story in your money quietly, boringly doubling every several years in the background of your life. But that quiet, unremarkable process is the actual engine behind nearly every ordinary person who has ever built real wealth without winning the lottery or inheriting a fortune. And the single habit that kills this engine before it ever gets started is delay. Waiting until you make more money. Waiting until the market feels calmer. Waiting until you understand it a little better first. Every year spent waiting isn't a neutral, harmless decision. It is an active decision to permanently give up years of compounding that can never ever be recovered later, no matter how much money you eventually decide to invest. To really feel the weight of that delay, picture two friends who graduate around the same time, earn similar salaries, and live fairly similar lives. One of them starts investing a modest amount every single month right away, even though it feels small, even though it barely seems to matter at first. The other one fully intends to start, but life keeps getting in the way. A wedding, a new apartment, a rough year at work, and so the actual investing keeps getting pushed to next year, again and again, for close to a decade. When the second friend finally does start, they try to make up for lost time by investing more money each month than the first friend ever did. And yet, because of how compounding works, quietly stacking growth on top of growth on top of growth, the friend who started earlier and invested less almost always ends up ahead by the time retirement actually arrives, sometimes by a staggering margin. Not because they were smarter, not because they picked better investments, simply because time itself was doing a huge share of the work the entire time, invisibly, in the background, while the other friend was still deciding when to begin. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly enough. Growing older isn't just costing you time in some vague, poetic sense. When it comes to money, time is quite literally the raw material that wealth is built from. And once a year of it is gone, no amount of hustle or discipline later on can ever fully replace it. Which brings us to a mistake so common, it barely even registers as a mistake anymore. Mostly because nearly everyone around you is making it too. Using debt to fund a lifestyle instead of to build an asset. There is a meaningful difference between debt that buys you something capable of producing value over time and debt that buys you something that begins losing value the second you drive it off the lot or the moment the trend fades away. A loan for an education that increases your future earning potential, or a mortgage on a home in a stable market, functions completely differently in your financial life than an auto loan on a vehicle that depreciates every single year it exists, or credit card debt used to fund a lifestyle you genuinely could not otherwise afford. The trap here isn't debt itself. Used correctly, debt has helped build enormous fortunes throughout history. The trap is using debt to feel wealthy in the present, while quietly borrowing against your own future income to pay for things that will be completely worthless in 5 years. And because credit is so easy to access, so normalized, so seamlessly woven into everyday spending, most people never pause to ask one simple question before swiping the card. Is this debt going to make me money later? Or is it simply going to cost me money later, with interest quietly attached the entire time? Here's something that rarely gets said out loud, because it sounds harsh, but it needs to be said anyway. Many people who consider themselves financially responsible are still making a version of this exact mistake without ever realizing it. Because the real danger was never the obvious overspender racking up debt on luxury purchases. The real danger is the person who does everything right on paper, pays every bill on time, avoids anything flashy, and still has no actual plan for where their money is supposed to go over the next 20 years. Discipline without direction just means you're being very careful about drifting slowly instead of drifting quickly. Either way, you still end up washed ashore in the exact same place. And this is where a fourth habit quietly reveals itself, hiding underneath all the others: the complete absence of a real emergency fund. Not a vague feeling that you'd probably figure something out if a crisis hit, but an actual funded cushion set aside specifically for the unexpected. Because here is what really happens to families without without one. A car breaks down, a medical bill arrives out of nowhere, a job disappears for a few unlucky months, and suddenly the only tool sitting within reach to survive that gap is a credit card or a high-interest loan, far more expensive than almost any investment could have reasonably earned in the same amount of time. What began as a temporary emergency slowly transforms into long-term debt, sometimes taking years to fully pay off, all because there was never a buffer built between a single moment of crisis and full-blown financial disaster. This one missing habit is one of the most common reasons responsible-seeming families end up trapped in cycles of debt that have nothing to do with irresponsibility and everything to do with the absence of a simple, boring safety net that people always intend to build someday, but somehow never quite get around to actually funding. Now let's talk about the habit that feels the most exciting of all and is often the most damaging because it never looks like a mistake while it's actually happening. It looks like ambition. It's the endless search for the fast way out, the hot stock tip from a coworker at lunch, the trending investment everyone online seems to be making easy money from overnight, the quiet belief that if you can just find the right opportunity at exactly the right moment, you can skip the slow, boring decades of steady investing and leap straight to the finish line. This impulse is deeply human and completely understandable, especially for people who feel like they started too late or don't have enough years left for slow compounding to do its quiet magic. But chasing quick wins tends to produce the opposite of wealth, because it almost always means buying into something after it has already become popular, when the price is already high and the excitement is already loudest, and then selling in panic the moment it drops, which is often exactly the moment a patient investor would be holding steady or even buying more. This pattern shows up again and again throughout financial history. Fear and excitement push people to move at precisely the wrong moments, while the steadiest, most unremarkable long-term investors, the ones nobody ever makes an exciting documentary about, tend to end up the wealthiest simply because they stayed the course while everyone else around them was reacting emotionally. And underneath every single one of these habits lies something even deeper, something psychological rather than mathematical, and it might just be the most important idea in this entire story. Most people were never actually taught to think of their income as a tool with a specific job to do. They were taught to think of it as a reward to be spent. Nobody ever sat most of us down and explained that every dollar entering our life is essentially an employee, and it's our job as the boss to decide exactly what that employee's task is going to be. Some dollars can absolutely be assigned to short-term enjoyment. That's not wrong. Life is meant to be lived, and depriving yourself completely is its own quiet form of failure. But other dollars need to be assigned a very different job entirely, the job of generating more dollars over time, quietly, patiently, without needing your attention every single day. The households who eventually break free from the paycheck to paycheck cycle are rarely the ones who simply earned dramatically more money than everyone else around them. They are the ones who assigned a portion of every single paycheck a specific job before lifestyle, before comparison, before impulse ever got the chance to claim it first. There's one final habit, and it might be the quietest one of all, because on the surface, it doesn't even look like it's about money. It's about relying completely on a single source of income and never bothering to build a second one. For most of human history, income came from exactly one place: a job, a trade, a single employer who could raise your pay, freeze it, or take it away entirely on a random Tuesday. And for a good chunk of the 20th century, that felt safe enough, because the social contract around long-term employment was still relatively strong. But that contract has quietly shifted underneath everyone's feet. Industries transform overnight. Roles get automated out of existence. Companies restructure without warning. And the households who feel that shift most painfully are always the ones whose entire financial existence depends on a single income stream continuing forever, exactly the way it always has. Building even a small second stream, whether through investing, a side skill, freelance work, rental income, or some other form of value creation, isn't really about greed, and it isn't about hustle culture either. It's about resilience. It's about making absolutely sure that if one door slams shut without warning, you're not left standing alone in a completely dark room with no other way out. When you line up all of these habits side by side, spending that quietly rises to swallow every raise, fear of investing dressed up as caution, the failure to let time and compounding do their slow, patient work, debt used to fund things that disappear instead of assets that grow, no real cushion built for the inevitable emergency, the constant temptation to chase fast money instead of trusting slow, steady money, and a complete dependence on a single fragile source of income, a pattern starts to emerge that has almost nothing to do with intelligence, effort, or even how much someone earns. These are not the habits of foolish people. They are the habits of ordinary, hardworking people who were simply never handed a different blueprint, who inherited financial instincts from a culture that rewards spending and quietly punishes patience. A culture that celebrates the appearance of wealth far more loudly than it ever celebrates the slow, invisible architecture of actually building it. The middle class doesn't stay the middle class because its people refuse to work hard enough. It stays the middle class because the habits that feel safe, normal, and perfectly responsible in the short term are often the exact same habits that quietly guarantee stagnation over the long run. Here's the uncomfortable truth. This entire story has been circling from the very first sentence. Wealth is rarely stolen from people through one single catastrophic decision. It's given away one quiet, completely reasonable-looking choice at a time, spread out silently across decades, disguised as ordinary life, until one day the version of you who could have been financially free simply doesn't have enough runway left to become that person. The only real difference between the life you're currently living and the one running quietly in parallel to it, the one with more freedom, fewer sleepless nights, and far less fear about the future, was never a secret hiding somewhere out of reach. It has always been a set of small, boring decisions, repeated patiently, long after they stopped feeling exciting or new. If even one of these 7 habits made you pause, made you think of a specific moment in your own life, a raise that quietly turned into a bigger car payment, savings account you've been proud of that's actually losing value every year, an investment you keep telling yourself you'll start next month, then the most valuable thing you can do right now isn't to close this video and forget about it by tomorrow morning. It's to stay in this conversation. Because understanding these habits is only step 1. Recognizing them in your own life happens next. And actually building something different from here forward is the real work still ahead. If you want more of these deep, honest breakdowns of how money really works, the psychology behind why smart people make these mistakes, and what the people who actually escape the paycheck to paycheck cycle do differently, subscribe to this channel right now, because this is exactly the kind of thing we break down here every single week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Because the moment you finally see these habits clearly, really see them, is the exact moment you get to choose. You can keep living out the same quiet story that so many people around you are living without ever questioning it. Or you can start writing a completely different ending, one small, unremarkable, patient decision at a time, starting today while you still have enough years left for it to matter.